All right. Welcome. This is Data Privacy for Startups. I'm Andy Dale. I'm the General Counsel of Alice. Prior to that, I was the General Counsel of a company called SessionM, which we sold to MasterCard in 2019. And I'm joined by Christine Sullivan, who's still with MasterCard. I'm going to go through a little bit of a few slides on data privacy, and then Christine and I will do a Q&A to try to get really practical about data and privacy and how to build products. And I think that's where you'll find a lot of value, hopefully, and we'll get going. So this is my take on one of the things that's most relevant with respect to data and privacy right now is just the value of data in the marketplace. And if anyone's starting a company, you've seen how critical these questions can be, and they're being addressed now and more than ever. It's a resource every business is harnessing. When I was a lawyer inside of the legal team at TD Ameritrade, I joined them at a time when they were just starting to leverage data, and they built a data management platform and started utilizing cookies for advertising and marketing. And this was a time when data was becoming more and more actionable by teams for advertising, marketing, for actually building data assets within the company. And that's only grown. That's just gotten exponentially more the case. When I left TD Ameritrade, I went to an ad tech company here in Boston called DataZoo. And in doing that, as I left, the chief privacy officer at TD Ameritrade said to me, you're going to have a lot of privacy issues at that company. And I said, well, what do you mean? It's just cookies. And he laughed and he said, you'll see. And he was absolutely right. When I arrived at that company and sat down with the CEO on my first day, privacy was one of the first things that he called out. Data was one of the first things that he called out. He said, obviously, you're the lawyer, get your arms around the contracts and the things that matter with respect to revenue. But the other thing I really want you to be attentive to is our data. And data is just a ubiquitous part of conversations, and now more and more becoming part of the strategy conversation. And I included this slide. This is just to visualize that it used to be a late stage company issue, or a later stage, where companies would be building a product or service and then thinking about the data that they're trying to harness as an asset or just an afterthought. What data do we have? Oh, I guess maybe we could do something with it. This is a seed stage issue now. Like, this is like from the get-go. When I joined Alice, which is Series A stage company, some of the first discussions I had at the board level were about data and data strategy. In our first board meeting, it was a heavy piece of the conversation. Board members are investors are engaged more deeply on data than they ever have been. And so it's an early stage issue. It's an every stage issue. I'm going to do here just a little bit of quick history, and then we'll get into the better part, which is discussing things with Christine. But just as background, so that you can sort of understand where we're coming from with this stuff. Privacy is not expressly in the United States Constitution. It's derived from readings of certain amendments: the First Amendment, Third, Fourth, Fifth, and 14th. The First Amendment is expression. Third Amendment is privacy in your home. Fourth Amendment, people may be familiar with, freedom from unlawful search or seizure of someone's body or their possessions. The Fifth Amendment is due process with respect to the law, and the 14th is equal protection for people under the law. And the privacy right has been read into that through cases, through looking at these different amendments through different fact patterns. There's a case called Griswold versus Connecticut from 1965 that created a privacy right with who to marry, and privacy with respect to using contraception without government interference. And those are foundational decisions that led, to gay marriage decisions and things like that. Privacy it sits at the base of some of those decisions. And also one, people are familiar with Roe v. Wade, the right to abortion without government interference. These are the places we look in the Constitution. I always like to show this quote. This is from The West Wing. I don't know if anybody watches this show, but this is 1999 when they were vetting a Supreme Court justice. which is very timely now as we go into this extra weird situation of trying to think about filling a Supreme Court seat. This is Sam Seaborn, one of the characters, talking about how important privacy is when making a decision about justices, and how it should be fundamental in the United States, and that privacy is really, really important. There was a judicial candidate that had maybe some inconsistency in their decision making around privacy, and he was sort of standing up and saying, no, this is really, really important, and it touches a lot of pieces of the Constitution. So I think I always like to show this because I think it's very prescient. So I want to also draw a distinction between the United States and Europe. Europe is relevant because we'll talk about the GDPR in a few minutes. And Europe has a long, long history of privacy rights going back pre-World War II. In World War II, personal information was used to identify Holocaust victims. And so there's a scarred history there, and an understanding that data and information should be used in certain ways and should be viewed as a fundamental right. And people in Europe care deeply about privacy, about data protection, and there's a regulatory history there as well. When the GDPR went live in 2018, there was a pre-existing law that people weren't really talking about quite as much, called the EU directive, because the EU directive had a different structure than the GDPR. The GDPR is a overarching regulation which applies to all of the EU, and the directive was something that was then to be applied to the different member states, and they drafted their own versions of the EU directive. But I bring this up because this isn't anything new in Europe. They've had privacy laws for a long time. Canada has as well. And the US has taken a very different approach. The US approach is very sectoral. You may have heard of these laws, but they focus on data and privacy with respect to verticals or segments. HIPAA, FERPA, FCRA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley. These are laws specifically dealing with information, personal information in these realms. And the US has taken this approach as opposed to creating an overarching federal privacy law. We'll get to the kind of goings on in Washington about that in a minute. There may be some movement on that. One note I had in here, just because of kind of the businesses that Christine and I are both in, advertising and marketing, has never really had its own sectoral law focused on this. We've had self-regulatory codes called the Network Advertising Initiative Code and the DAA code. These are advertising codes. And the result of that is that those industries have had to sort of police themselves and create ethical and legal frameworks with respect to personal information. And it ends up, because the technology advancement in marketing and advertising seems to move at light speed, it often flies well past any of the laws or any regulatory action. And you have technology and innovation, as always is the case, moving much more quickly than regulation. And so advertising and marketing has often driven a lot of the kind of technical rules or thinking that we've had about privacy in the United States. The other thing to highlight is, over the last few years, there's been a heightened sensitivity around data and privacy and personal information. You have a continued repeated loss of trust from consumers. Edward Snowden revelations, massive data breaches by Yahoo, billions of accounts, and Equifax, and several others that have happened even since then. There's a facial recognition database that was breached that has millions and millions of records. And so there's a generalized loss of trust. There's and this will come in a little bit later when we talk about the GDPR. But this is an environment created in the United States, as well as an environment that is playing out all over the world. And one way this is played out is in California. This is Alistair McTaggart, who's a real estate developer, who was at a cocktail party in California talking to an engineer from Google casually, and the engineer said something like, you'd be horrified if you knew how much data Google has about you. And he dug into it, and he got really fired up about this and created a ballot initiative in California. And the ballot initiative was crudely written, quickly written. And in order to avoid that, the legislature very quickly created this law called the California Consumer Privacy Act, and that was passed instead of that ballot initiative. And now you have the CCPA and the GDPR creating sort of for US companies a floor, if you will, around rights that need to be provided to consumers when you're thinking about processing personal data of an individual. So starting with the GDPR, because it came first, the definition of personal data is really broad. It's not just name, address, it's device identifiers, it's IP addresses. It doesn't fit the definition that you might just sort of think off the bat. The GDPR has a basic rule that if you're going to process personal information, you have to have a legal basis to do that. And there are a series of different legal bases for processing that need to be thought through individually as you collect data. The definition of processing is very wide. That can be really doing pretty much anything with the data. So, just a point to remember, these are very broadly written laws, both the CCPA and the GDPR. So this is not an area where you want to engage in guesswork. You want to, and I'll get to some of the ways in which you can avoid that later. But the GDPR has these concepts of controllers and processors, which are an important distinction. The CCPA has a corollary concept, basically similar: businesses versus service providers. You have companies that are controlling data, gathering data directly from an end user or a person. And then you have companies that are receiving that data and then taking action or processing that data. The big things that these laws do for consumers are create rights for consumers: access to their personal information, deletion, and in the case of CCPA, an ability to say, stop selling my data, which is a very interesting concept, very ununderstood. The CCPA is brand new. The definition of sale is very, very, very broad. It's not sell for money. It can be share, disclose, and so the total clear contours of sale are not yet understood. We won't understand it fully until we see it in practice. There is a follow-on law called the CPRA, which is on the ballot for November 3rd, which will fundamentally shift the CCPA as well. So I say this to you all not to make you worry, but just know this is a moving target. There's a lot happening here, and a practice tip or a practical point would be: find experts in this area. If you have data, if you have a data asset you're trying to amass, you can contact me. I'm happy to connect you, or Christine. We can connect you with people that can help you sort through these things. And this is a really nice segue for me into talking with Christine, because one of those things that a business of any stage, but mostly startups, really need are people on the business side or the product technology side that are willing to dig in on this stuff, because you won't have a lawyer right away. It'll be very atypical for you to have a lawyer in at the seed stage or even really an A round, right? Those lawyers typically come later. So your outside counsel is who you're relying on, and they may give you a laundry list of things to do. And that just means it needs people in the business that are taking the time to try to understand it and understand practically how you can solve these problems. And so with practicality, it's a great segue to Christine, who's one of the more practical colleagues I've ever had. So this is Christine. I'll let her introduce herself, and then we'll do a little Q&A here.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. This is Christine Sullivan. I'm a director of product at SessionM. And as Andy mentioned, we were acquired by MasterCard last year. So joined SessionM in 2016. So right before some of these fundamental laws we were talking about went into effect. And really since that time, data privacy has been a fundamental part of our product conversations and overarching business conversations. But now also having seen an acquisition and being on the other side of it, again, even even now working with different legal teams, but making sure that we're, as a SessionM product team, staying very engaged with our legal counterparts and what's going on in the broader international law ecosystem. So yeah, excited to be here and excited for all the events startup Boston Week's having.
Awesome. Let's dig right in, Christine. So let's talk about when we first met. When I joined SessionM, I was getting coffee and I bumped into a colleague of Christine's named Greg Muir. And he said, "Oh, you're the lawyer." He said, "We're going to be working together a lot." And so kudos to Greg, because he knew how product needed to be involved in that data conversation. And that led to my first meeting with Christine and Greg and a couple others on the team. And I was really impressed with how quickly they had dug in just on some of the fundamentals of creating the features. Because remember, the GDPR launched in May of 2018 and I joined SessionM in March. So we didn't have a whole bunch of time, and luckily they had been thinking about it. So go back before I got there, Christine, how did you guys start approaching it and thinking about it from a product perspective?
So one of the good points there was, I think when, in any sort of early stage company, as you start hearing new legal precedents being set, new regulations are going into effect, they're affecting geographies where you have a business footprint. We definitely did have engagement, as Andy mentioned, on our board as well as in our C-suite on these legal ramifications or implications coming into effect that would impact our product. And in our case, we did have someone sitting in an operations role, but that did also have a legal background, and of course had an inroads into our contracted legal counsel, where as a, really getting that up to date into our product team about considerations that needed to go into effect in terms of features we need to build and use cases that we need to consider associated with the regulation. And a lot of that work went underway. It really was, to Andy's point, getting into a room, looking at the regulations. I would say if there are product managers on the call, of all the hats and responsibilities included in your job, you are not tasked with being a lawyer. So definitely work with those people who have that expertise and are really staying current on legal and regulation. And for us, it was going through almost line by line to understand the implications of the regulation and the impact, first at a high level, to how that would affect areas of the platform and what we needed to do. And then really looking at it as a feature set like any other and bringing it through our product development process. So bringing in design, bringing in architects, and then of course, once it went into development, the feature set itself, working really closely with the development teams.
What are some of the challenges? Like let's highlight some of the challenges, not to go too in the weeds, but some of the challenges that we had when we were you're looking at a system that was architected prior to these laws really being part of the deal. And so how were you able to sort of think through, like, okay, what should my approach be with a system that really wasn't, built totally, wasn't built totally with privacy in mind,
Yeah, so I think that will continue to be as we see new regulations, some of which might tweak what's out there today, go into effect, and this relates into that second bullet, where you truly need to understand the ecosystem in which you're working, and especially with early stage and as your business is growing, in terms of internal governance and internal due diligence, keep your documentation up to date on what your data management footprint looks like, where you're storing data, how it's being used, and so forth. I think a product manager on SessionM's team, Andrew Ramirez, we were talking about something else, but he said, we were talking about this in relation to tech debt, another beloved product management project, but it was essentially, as you need to clean your house, if you do that bit by bit and keep on top of it, that is a lot more manageable and sustainable than if you're faced at a certain moment in time, say a pandemic, where then you need to go into a deep clean and you haven't been maintaining it. So I think one of the biggest places for us is really just laying all the cards out there and ensuring that we have our ecosystem fully documented, where we're pinpointing how data flows, where we're pinpointing how certain data stores might be used. And then in the case of where we add new features or new functionality or supporting new use cases, to make sure that that documentation layer is updating. But I would say in the case of where, you know, these laws didn't exist and how we had to then go and look back, I think this will be a case of, we see this with other features all the time, where you get a new use case, you want to try to solution that and bring value to the market as quickly as possible, be it new revenue or in this case, compliance to a law. And you simply need to really know the fundamentals of what's working under the hood. And so that's where I think just, you know, deep collaboration and partnership with your engineering counterparts is also a fundamental aspect in really being able to put privacy into the forefront of your product strategy.
How did you find that with engineers? How did you find that collaboration on these things? Did you find that you needed to gross them up on privacy stuff, or were they interested into it, aware?
So in our case, we're such a fundamental component of our value add in the market, and then I think internal in terms of getting great talent to join our company is associated with us being overarchingly a data management platform and then having loyalty and engagement capabilities on top of that. So you already do have probably this natural group of people that are already very interested in these types of questions and problems and how to deliver value in terms of to our clients as well as to the market. And I would say that in that case, you already have a leaning where it's not as if someone's going into an organic chemistry class, but they really want to be studying English Lit, right? Like that's a big difference. I would say in the case of where prior to you joining and then upon you joining as well, it was really working with the experts that we had associated with obviously legal advice and then of course data privacy itself, where it really was just all of us, you know, bring engineers, especially in terms of tech leads and architects, into the conversation early. That's going to save so many, I would say that again, for a lot of feature development, obviously engineering resources, super valuable. You want to make sure that people are maximizing their time and really where they want to be spending their attention. And that said, I would say especially within technical leads, architecture positions, these are the conversations they want to be joined, they want to join in really early. And that will avoid so many games of telephone, especially in the case, to Andy's point, where if you're at a super early stage company and your legal counsel's not sitting in-house and you do need to make the most of those external communications with them, it's really important to just have engineering in the picture super early. And I would imagine, again, if you're any sort of, and probably most products are at this point, but if you're any sort of like super data management centric platform, you will have at the senior most level product and engineering counterparts who want to be part of those conversations.
I think it feeds into the discussion about privacy by design and a concept that these laws, GDPR in particular, calls out, you must engage in privacy by design. And that's a little squishy in what it means, but the way I interpret it, people interpret it in many different ways, but one of the ways I interpreted it was exactly as you just described, Christine. Like, we're going to be in the room, not to block things, but to facilitate and help decision-making around features. And we created cross-functional teams to manage certain features, and we had regular meetings about these things, not just dominated by data and privacy discussions, but discussing the features, and then the ability to raise questions, ask things, and the critical nature of batting those things around internally. Whether you have a lawyer in the room or whether you don't, you at least can bubble up the right questions.
And I would say, just from the cross-functional point, and note to product and legal counterparts or anyone else in any other discipline, in those cross-functional groups, we had legal, product, engineering, And then in many of them, we also had a presence from marketing and other sort of business architecture or sales function. So as you're thinking about, obviously, especially in the case where can be very strict timelines where businesses need to comply, and you're also dealing with, as Andy mentioned, a lot of unknowns and a lot of where we're still learning, right? And no one has like the precise answer of, one, the regulations themselves, or two, how they then translate into a feature. Where I think in certain cases where with positioning and marketing and how your own privacy by design function evolves, I think one of the things is working with legal to make sure that you're obviously covered and that you are designing features and delivering results to in order to fulfill the requests of the consumer, which is obviously of utmost importance. But then also within product engineering, marketing, and so forth, having that more iterative mindset where you want to lay the foundation, but also as we go and we see just more information from legal or more information from the market, where you can, adjust positioning that's going out, where you can understand enhancements that you want to make to your user flows. So again, taking a very iterative product development process and applying that to privacy by design. But yeah, our cross-functional teams really did span multiple groups getting into the room about this.
You mentioned something that's critical that I want to call out, which is the market.
Yeah.
And the role of a in my opinion, and probably others, what makes product a difficult and interesting role at the same time is that you need to be engineering facing, understanding the business, but then also out in the market and like interacting with customers, prospects. And so what did you learn? We both tried to do this, in our different ways. I would, in negotiating the contract, and then after would be spending time with counterparts at clients that paid dividends for a whole host of reasons, but really understanding, what do you care about? What do you want? What do you need to see? What are the most pressing things from a compliance perspective? And then how do we translate into features you want? But like, talk about that a little bit, because I know that's a big part of what you learned from clients as well. You learned from the market, and then we have to translate those into features.
So I think one of I was reflecting on this, and even, in relation to this talk, but even outside of this talk, one of the more interesting components when you have these big, very hot topics that also align, and not just topics, laws, that also align with certain punitive situations that can occur if you lack compliance, right? Like, inherent in that, you don't just have something that needs to be delivered by a certain time because there's some legality or compliance around it. You also then have with your user base, be it clients or even end consumers, you have some fear also to manage, and just some unknowingness around, oh no, we need to drop everything and think of, whatever it be, like 2 quarters out to make sure that we have this data privacy program in place that doesn't really exist in the way that meets the regulatory implications that will go into effect, or that just have gone into effect. So I think first off, it's like understanding, taking the approach of what the user needs. And so Andy and I were on a few conversations, and it still to date comes up on, I can reference this on many a client call, user call that I've been on recently, where having the client, in our case, our users are clients, having the client speak to their data privacy program and what they're trying to do in relation to that already has exposed ways in which we can make our feature set to date more efficient. That's one of the key ways. So understanding their own privacy program and what's of top of mind for them, as well as where they might still have questions and unknowns. So I think in the early days of talking about GDPR as well as about CCPA, and Andy and I had a few conversations where, we were ready. We came to the party with like, we'll talk to you about our privacy by design. Here are our features. And I think in certain cases where so much of the tech world and consumer brands are, quickly orienting to more and more privacy laws going into effect, sometimes it was like, oh gosh, I just don't know. And so I think the best thing you can do, again, with product where you're out in the market, as well as where you're listening to user needs and wanting to deliver value back out to them, is being really, really clear on what your feature set offers. And then in the case if there's an enhancement roadmap, being really clear on what's to come.
There's a nuanced difference there also that between B2B and B2C, right?
Yes.
Where we're talking pretty much about B2B businesses here now. And so supporting the client, I want to be able to be as practical as I can here in this talk. Like, yeah, if you are B2B and you're creating software and you are enabling their compliance, that's a key point. You have your own compliance program to run about yourself, but it's going to be less robust probably or rather in comparison to your responsibility to your customer, particularly if you serve the enterprise. The expectations are very high, the compliance burden is high. So the practical tip I would say is for B2B, be really focused in that area. Focus on, is it clear that the landing page and area of the platform that my client needs to go to do a certain thing is clear. It is right here. This is where I know to go to it. There is a button where I can select between things and I am achieving a desired result. What happens on the back end is important, but I think somewhat needs to be viewed through the lens of the customer. What are they seeing? I remember I was in a conversation once with 2 companies ago with a mutual friend of ours, Adam Markey, and a couple other people from another company that was trying to sell us something. I forget whether I think it was data related or feature related. And Adam just paused the conversation. He just said, "How fast until I can get a button in the UI?" Like, and you know, that's really, he's sort of half kidding, but he really isn't. Like, he's shortcut, like, give me the shortcut. This is what the B2B customer wants. They need to know where to go. So of all the practical things I could say, I'll let Christine comment a little more on the product side of that, because I'm clearly oversimplifying things here, but they do need a place to go.
Yeah, for us, we took designing out APIs and then also the UI itself. And I would say in the context of where we're seeing usage, a lot of it, given to Andy's point, where we're, you know, one part of, and it could be a big part, but still one part of a broader marketing or data management ecosystem for our clients, where oftentimes the solution they have in place internally really wants to leverage the APIs to execute the requests on behalf of the end consumer. But in the case of where, you know, from our functionality to date, where we do have UI and we have a customer care function within our platform, it was really making that very present within that customer care module, that of the data privacy functions that could be executed right from that UI, to Andy's point, clicking a button and then being able to follow the request through to once it had been completed and a status had been changed. I would say the other part of that, which goes back to, you know, as much as it's understanding your own internal data ecosystem in order to understand, as you design these features, what needs to be considered in-house. Also, as you obviously get new features out to market, I think this again is just where, and this comes up so much, but where documentation really matters, and concisely summarizing the feature set and how it's supposed to be used. So even on our feature set to date, especially with the new CCPA regulation, it was really revisiting what we had out on some of our doc sites and making sure that it was updated and crystallized. And that was a place with now Andy being at Alice, where we're working with other legal counterparts, and we have more regulations going into effect or pending, where we've just been working in concert with them, that I think, to Andy's point, our feature set is delivering the value add is in order for the client to be able to maintain compliance of their own data ecosystem in relation to the consumer's rights. And so again, just another touch, and this actually probably stands for mentioning, is you don't just need to have these legal touch points upon a new regulation. Like GDPR, there was so much, even though it wasn't as if there were crazy long time horizons, But there was just so much noteworthy news associated with the preparation for that, which by very nature, as we mentioned, you have cross-team syncs and you're making sure that you're talking on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. However, I do think it's very important, and the cadence could differ, especially again, if you're early stage and those contacts out to an external legal team, you're being very concerted about making the most of those and the timeliness of them and the sort of time limitingness of them just due to expenses and so forth. I would say that just making sure that you're at a standing cadence of ensuring that communication back and forth and making sure from your legal counterparts, you're really staying up on what needs to be considered in-house within your platform, be it B2C or B2B. So those should be regular touch points, and whatever that cadence, like we have a regular touch point. At this case, it's either going to be, I think monthly, but in certain cases we would scale that up to every other week. But definitely something to keep in mind that this is ongoing. It's not just in relation to one regulation, and that ongoing communication will help as new regulations get introduced, and you need to consider, how does this affect the roadmap? How do we think about development? How do we think about marketing activities and so forth?
That's so true. And it sort of relates to one of the questions. So we'll answer one of the questions on Slido here, which is to talk about B2C. And I'll just say briefly, like, some of the tenets are the same. With B2C, it's not a button in your platform, it's a button on your privacy policy, or not a button, or just do they have a place to go? Do they have a place to go to understand, is your privacy policy legible in the sense that can a consumer find it? Can they read it? Can they understand it? And then the other piece that is sort of related to this is, the other question here is, what can organizations do to avoid costly regulatory fines? Well, I have a couple answers to that one, but it's also those things that we just mentioned, which are create, like, be thinking about the issues a lot, have conversations internally, have regular meetings, document the fact that you're having those, use Confluence to your advantage, track things like you would any other project or product. It is a product, it is a feature. And so track it in the same way, track your decision-making in the same way. Regulatory issues come up when something has not been thought of, something has been ignored, or you haven't kept any sort of documentation about anything that you're doing. That's where the data mapping comes in, where Christine's talking about hygiene around data flows, keeping it updated. Those are the kinds of things that you can do if you ever had the situation of having to deal with a regulator. Well, they're human beings too. What they want to hear is, what did you do about this issue? And if your answer is, I did nothing, that's obviously a terrible answer. And if your answer is, I did all of these things, I was attempting to do right by the consumer, or I was attempting to do these different things for my B2B customers, and I needed to be doing something differently, very different conversation with the regulator than the former.